The air was thick with humidity as the tour boat glided slowly through the twisting veins of the Louisiana bayou. Tourists, a mix of adventurous spirits and eager photographers, sat on wooden benches as their guide, a grizzled Cajun named Jeb, steered the boat through the murky green waters. Spanish moss hung like tattered curtains from the cypress trees, casting long, unsettling shadows across the water. "Y'all wanna see a gator?" "Keep your eyes peeled," Jeb called out with a toothy grin. His accent was thick, and his eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses. "This here swamp's full of M." The group leaned over the sides, cameras ready, hoping for a glimpse of something wild. A light breeze stirred the thick air, and the insects hummed louder than any city sound. For most, this was an escape, a chance to experience something truly primal, the untamed wilderness of the South. The air buzzed with the excitement of exploration. As they rounded a sharp bend in the bayou, the engine sputtered. The boat lurched, causing a few gasps. Jeb frowned, glancing back at the motor. He gave it a few hard twists and smacked it once, but the engine coughed again, spitting out an oily cloud of smoke before going silent. "Well, now, that ain't supposed to happen," he muttered under his breath. The tourists exchanged nervous glances, the buzz of excitement quickly turning to uncertainty. "What's going on?" one of them asked. "Must be the old engine actin' up." "Nothin' to worry about," Jeb said, though his voice lacked the usual confidence. He fumbled with a tool, his broad hands suddenly less sure of themselves. The boat drifted, its hull cutting silently through the water, deeper into the labyrinth of the bayou. The trees grew denser, their branches curling over the water like bony fingers reaching out to snatch the boat. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a blood-orange glow on the horizon. Shadows stretched longer, darker. The silence stretched too. No more tourist chatter. No more reassuring guide voice. Just the steady drip of water from the leaves and the occasional splash of something unseen beneath the surface. Suddenly, there was a loud thud beneath the boat. The entire vessel shuddered violently, knocking several tourists off their seats. Gasps and screams filled the humid air as everyone scrambled to stay upright. Jeb's eyes widened behind his sunglasses. "Probably just hit a log or something," he said quickly, though his face had gone pale. "We'll be outta here soon." Another thud, this time harder, as if something large had struck the boat deliberately. Jeb looked out into the water, scanning the surface. His hand went to the shotgun hanging by his side, but he didn't raise it, yet. "What was that?" a man from the back asked, his voice shaking. The others huddled together, their excitement now fully replaced by fear. Before Jeb could respond, something stirred in the water. A shape, long and sinuous, slipped beneath the surface, vanishing as quickly as it appeared. It was too fast for anyone to get a good look, but it was enough to send a shiver through the boat. "Y'all stay calm now," Jeb said, though his voice was strained. He grabbed a flashlight and scanned the water again, the beam barely cutting through the thickening fog that seemed to rise from the swamp. Then the water broke. A dark, slick mass emerged with a violent splash, too fast, too large to be anything natural. It disappeared just as quickly, leaving nothing but ripples in its wake. The tourists screamed, their panic setting in. And then, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the bayou into deep twilight, the boat came to a sudden, complete stop. Silence. Something old was watching them. The silence clung to the boat like a suffocating shroud. No one moved. Even the tourists who had been chattering nervously just moments before now stared into the thickening mist, their breaths shallow, eyes wide. The boat swayed slightly in the still water, the only sound the distant croak of a bullfrog and the occasional rustle of unseen things in the trees. Jeb's hand never left the shotgun. His eyes, hidden behind those dark glasses, scanned the water with a nervous intensity. He took a step toward the edge of the boat, squinting into the gathering shadows, and then, with a quick motion, clicked on a second flashlight and threw the beam across the surface of the bayou. "Okay now, y'all stay calm," he said again, but this time his voice trembled. "Ain't nothin' but an animal, probably a big gator. They get curious at night." But nobody believed him. Not anymore. A woman near the front of the boat let out a sharp gasp. "There's something out there," she whispered, pointing into the fog. The others squinted, trying to follow her trembling finger. At first, no one saw it, but then. 2 pinpricks of light. Eyes. Pale, glowing, and unnervingly still. They hovered just above the water's surface, unblinking. What is that?" a man whispered, his voice almost drowned by the thundering of his own heartbeat. Jeb raised the shotgun, the barrel shaking slightly. "Y'all stay back," he barked, but even as he said it, those glowing eyes disappeared beneath the surface. The water rippled, silent but menacing. He didn't fire. "Everyone, back in your seats," Jeb ordered, his voice higher, more frantic. "Now." The tourists scrambled, gripping the wooden benches, knuckles white with fear. The boat rocked slightly as they moved, and every sound felt like a thunderclap in the suffocating quiet. The mist thickened, curling around the boat like ghostly fingers, and the night air turned cold, far colder than it should have been. A deep, resonant splash echoed from behind them. They turned as one, every head snapping toward the sound. The mist parted for just a moment, revealing a figure, tall, impossibly tall, standing half submerged in the water behind the boat. Its shape was human, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its body twisted and hunched, with skin slick and black like the water it had risen from. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace, its head tilted as if it were studying them. The tourists froze, every muscle locking in place, as though the thing's gaze held them in some unspoken thrall. The figure let out a low, guttural sound, a noise so deep it seemed to rumble through the water and vibrate in their chests. The sound wasn't just something they heard, it was something they felt, a pulse of primal fear that swept over the boat like a crashing wave. Jeb's shotgun fired with a deafening boom, the flash of the muzzle lighting up the fog for a split second. The figure vanished into the water with a splash, and the tourists screamed, some covering their heads, others trying to crawl to the center of the boat as if the extra few feet would somehow protect them. "Stay down!" Jeb yelled, backing away from the edge. He loaded another shell into the shotgun, but his hands were trembling so violently it took him 3 tries. "Stay down, damn it!" The water was still now, unnervingly calm. It was as though whatever had emerged had simply dissolved back into the bayou, but the oppressive feeling of being watched remained. Jeb wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. "Ain't nothin' gonna get y'all if we stay quiet," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. He scanned the water again, flashlight beam jittering as his hand shook. From the trees, high in the tangled branches of the cypress, came a different noise. A slow, rhythmic creaking, as though something heavy was shifting in the canopy above them. The tourists craned their necks, squinting into the gloom, but the mist was too thick. They could see nothing beyond the gnarled silhouettes of the trees. Then, from the fog came a whisper. A sound so soft, so alien, that it almost didn't seem real. It was a voice, low, melodic, but not quite human. It circled the boat, flitting from one end to the other, as if the fog itself had come alive and was speaking directly to them. "Turn around," it said, barely audible. "Turn around and leave, or it will take you." The tourists exchanged terrified glances, but there was nowhere to go. The boat was still dead in the water, stranded deep in the bayou's endless maze. "Who's there?" Jeb shouted, aiming his shotgun into the fog. "Show yourself." The voice didn't answer. Instead, there was another loud splash from the water, closer this time, too close, and then, slowly, agonizingly, the boat began to drift backward, as though something unseen was pulling it deeper into the swamp. And that's when they saw them. Dozens of eyes, pale, glowing, unblinking, appeared in the mist, watching from the water and the trees above. The glowing eyes multiplied, blinking into existence from all around, staring down from the trees, staring up from the water, each pair fixed on the boat. The tourists were paralyzed, huddled together in terrified silence, barely daring to breathe. Some clutched their phones, but no one thought to take pictures anymore. It was as if the sheer unnatural presence of those eyes demanded their complete attention, like prey trapped in the gaze of predators. Jeb, for all his bluster, was visibly shaken now. His shotgun still pointed at the shifting mist, but his hands trembled violently, and he kept muttering to himself, as if trying to convince himself of something. "They're just gators," he whispered, though everyone knew better. Gators didn't have glowing eyes. Gators didn't whisper warnings in the fog. The boat creaked underfoot, rocking slightly as the current, if that's what it was, continued to drag them deeper into the bayou. The sky had darkened to a deep, inky black, with only slivers of moonlight breaking through the thick canopy above. Even the insects seemed to have fallen silent now, as though the swamp itself was holding its breath. Suddenly, the water beneath the boat shifted. A deep, low rumble vibrated through the hull, so low it was felt more than heard. Something large moved beneath them, the boat rocking violently to one side. One of the tourists, a young woman sitting near the edge, screamed as she lost her balance and tumbled into the water with a splash. "Sarah," her friend shrieked, lunging to the side, but the murky water swallowed her whole, her body vanishing beneath the surface in seconds. Jeb rushed to the side, pointing the flashlight into the dark waters, but there was no sign of her. Just the ripples spreading outward, the swamp looking deceptively calm. "We have to get her out," someone cried, panic rising in their voice. Jeb gritted his teeth, dropping the flashlight to grab a pole, ready to jab it into the water. But before he could act, the water bubbled again. Slowly, horribly, Sarah emerged. At first, it was just her head, dripping wet, her eyes wide, and her face slack with shock. She was staring straight ahead, mouth open in a silent scream. Jeb reached out with the pole, trying to pull her toward the boat, but the moment he touched her, her body was yanked violently downward, her head snapping back under the surface. And then something else surfaced. A hand, long, dark, and not human. Its fingers were unnaturally long, webbed, and tipped with ragged claws that scraped along the side of the boat as it slowly rose from the water. Then another hand, then an arm, and then the slick, black, elongated head of something ancient and monstrous. It was not a creature of the natural world. Its face was featureless, except for a gaping maw filled with sharp, jagged teeth. It moved with a slow, unnatural grace, as if it had all the time in the world. The tourists screamed, scrambling toward the middle of the boat, but there was nowhere to go. The thing pulled itself onto the side, its claws digging into the wood, causing it to groan under its weight. Jeb fired again, once, twice, the shotgun's deafening roar filling the swamp, but the creature didn't flinch. The bullets hit its slick skin and vanished as if they'd been swallowed. It turned its head toward him, a low, wet gurgle escaping from its throat, and Jeb stepped back, his resolve crumbling before the ancient horror now crawling onto his boat. Then, without warning, the boat lurched, tilting violently. The tourists screamed again, grabbing onto whatever they could, but it was too late. The creature had tipped them. The boat capsized with a sickening crash, sending everyone tumbling into the cold, murky depths of the bayou. The water closed in around them like a suffocating blanket, and immediately, the world became dark and disorienting. Limbs flailed as they struggled to break the surface, but the bayou held them tight, its water thick and heavy. Something brushed against their legs, slick, muscular, alive. One by one, they surfaced, gasping for breath, clawing for anything to hold on to. The boat had flipped completely, its belly now bobbing above the water. Panic surged through the group as they clung to the overturned hull, their legs thrashing in the water, desperate to escape whatever was moving below. "Where's Jeb?" a voice cried out, but no one answered. Jeb had been closest to the creature when the boat went under. There was no sign of him now. The water rippled again, but this time it wasn't just one shape beneath the surface. There were many. Dark, elongated figures gliding just beneath the murky depths, circling the tourists like sharks preparing to strike. Something latched onto one of the men, pulling him under with terrifying speed. He didn't even have time to scream. His hand shot up for a brief moment before vanishing into the black water, leaving nothing but bubbles in his wake. The others thrashed, screaming now, their terror palpable, but they were trapped, surrounded. Every splash seemed to draw more of the creatures, the water alive with their movement. Then came the voices again, swirling around them, low and menacing, but this time the message had changed. "It's hungry, it's always hungry." The mist grew thicker, the water darker, and whatever ancient hunger had awoken in the swamp was closing in. From beneath the overturned boat came a deep, guttural growl, louder than before, closer, and filled with a predatory menace. It wasn't just one creature anymore. They were surrounded. The water was no longer just a surface, it was alive. The tourists clung desperately to the overturned boat, their hands slipping on the slick wood as the dark shapes moved beneath them. The fog seemed to thicken with every passing second, swallowing the bayou in a shroud of cold, damp fear. And then, from the murk below, a long, low sound like a death rattle echoed up, vibrating through their bones. The growling hadn't stopped. It was coming closer, circling, echoing in the darkness. The woman who had screamed for Sarah earlier whimpered, her voice barely a whisper now, "We have to get out of the water. They're under us." Another scream cut the air, a man this time, one of the tourists who had been furthest from the overturned boat. He thrashed wildly, his eyes wide with terror as something unseen beneath the surface tugged him down. For a second, his head bobbed back up, his arms flailing desperately as he tried to keep above water, but then he was yanked under again. The last thing they saw was his mouth, open in a silent scream, before he was pulled beneath for good. The water grew eerily still for a moment. Too still. "We're not going to make it," a woman cried, her face pale with terror as she clung to the slippery side of the capsized boat. Her breath came in ragged gasps, and the others weren't faring much better. Panic was setting in, creeping into their bones like the cold of the swamp. A splash came from the far side of the boat, followed by a loud thunk. Something had rammed into the underside of the vessel with such force that it jolted everyone clinging to it. Another deep growl echoed through the mist, closer now, more aggressive. "They're trying to tip us over again," one of the men whispered, his eyes wide with realization. Jeb was still nowhere to be found, but the air was heavy with the smell of something far older than the swamp itself. There was a feeling, something primal, something ancient, that had risen from the depths and claimed this place as its own. These creatures weren't just hunting for sport. They were protecting something. Something dark and hungry that had been buried in the heart of the bayou for centuries. One of the tourists, a man with a red bandana and tattoos lining his arms, made a desperate decision. "We can't stay like this. We have to swim for the trees." He pointed toward the thick wall of cypress trees, their branches dipping into the water like skeletal arms. "They'll kill us before we get halfway there," another tourist, his face ashen with fear, replied. But Red Bandana wasn't listening. His fear had driven him to action, and without waiting for approval, he pushed off from the boat, kicking wildly toward the trees. "No," someone shouted, but it was too late. As soon as he left the relative safety of the boat, the water around him stirred violently. A massive shape moved beneath him, too fast to see clearly. He swam harder, faster, his arms churning the water as he neared the tree line. His breath came in ragged gasps, his eyes locked on the low-hanging branches that dangled just within reach. For a moment, it seemed like he might make it. Then, the water erupted. A huge, dark shape burst from the depths, impossibly fast. It hit him with such force that the water sprayed out in all directions, and his body vanished beneath the surface in an instant. There was no scream, no thrashing, just silence. The ripples spread out in lazy circles, and then, nothing. The remaining tourists stared in horror at the empty water where he'd been. No. No, 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 the woman beside the boat whispered, tears streaming down her face. We're going to die here, another loud thud. The boat rocked violently, nearly tipping again, and the growls seemed to multiply around them, as though the bayou itself was rumbling with hunger. A splash, then another thud, harder this time. The creatures were getting more aggressive, their attacks more deliberate. They're gonna flip us again, a man shouted, gripping the boat's edge as hard as he could. And then, as if in answer, the water exploded again, but this time from all sides. 3 dark shapes shot out of the water, towering over the capsized boat. Their bodies were long, slick, and reptilian, but twisted in unnatural ways, parts of them humanoid, parts of them grotesque. Their glowing eyes were now visible above the surface, staring down at the remaining survivors with a predatory hunger that sent shivers through every soul still clinging to the boat. They were not simple creatures. They were something far worse. Ancient. Malevolent. One of the creatures lunged, its webbed claw slashing across the side of the boat, splitting the wood with a horrible screeching sound. The boat cracked under the pressure, sinking further into the water. Another claw reached up, pulling itself onto the capsized hull. Its gaping maw opened, dripping with dark water and revealing rows of needle-like teeth. The tourists screamed, some trying to pull away, others frozen in place, their minds overwhelmed by sheer terror. In one swift motion, the creature wrapped a long, muscular arm around one of the women, yanking her off the boat and into its waiting jaws. She barely had time to scream before her body was crushed with a sickening crunch. The others watched in horror, paralyzed by fear. Another creature slithered closer, its eyes locking onto the remaining survivors. It reached out, claws dripping with swamp water, and as it did, the whispers returned. It's hungry, always hungry, and then, without warning, from behind the creatures, something shifted. The water moved, not with the speed of the creatures, but with a slower, more deliberate ripple. Something far larger, far more ancient, was rising from the depths. The creatures paused, turning their heads as though they, too, could feel it. Their growls softened, replaced by a different kind of sound, almost like a whimper. Then the thing surfaced. A massive, hulking shape rose from the water, its body covered in dark, slimy scales, but it was its eyes, 2 deep, glowing orbs, that filled the survivors with a new kind of dread. It was the source of the whispers, the hunger that had driven the smaller creatures. It was older than the swamp itself, a thing that had slept beneath the bayou for centuries. The thing let out a deep, resonant growl that seemed to shake the very air around them. The smaller creatures shrank back, their predatory hunger now replaced by something akin to reverence. Whatever hope the survivors had left was rapidly slipping away. The massive creature loomed above them, its dark, hulking form blotting out the scant light from the moon, casting the swamp into an abyssal darkness. The glowing eyes, deep and unnatural, locked onto the survivors with a cold intelligence, a hunger that went beyond the physical. This was no mere predator. This was something ancient, something that had existed long before the bayou itself. It had risen from the deep, called forth by the desperate, panicked cries of the tourists who now floated helplessly in its domain. The smaller creatures, which had once been the terror of the swamp, retreated into the mist, their glowing eyes flickering as they slipped beneath the water. They no longer seemed interested in the tourists. Their attention was fully on the hulking beast that had emerged from the depths. They circled it in reverence, as if recognizing their superior, the true master of the bayou. The creature let out a deep, rumbling growl, vibrating through the water and into the bones of the remaining tourists. Some clung to the overturned boat in sheer desperation, while others were too petrified to move. The air was thick with the scent of rot and decay, the smell of something long dead and long forgotten. What is that?" one of the tourists whimpered, his voice barely a whisper, as if speaking too loudly would draw the thing's attention. The creature didn't need to be addressed. It knew they were there. It could feel their fear, smell their desperation. Slowly, it began to move, its enormous body slicing through the water with a terrible grace. Its glowing eyes locked onto the remaining tourists, studying them as one might study insects caught in a web. A woman screamed, breaking the silence. It was a raw, guttural sound, born of pure terror, and it echoed through the bayou. The creature's head snapped in her direction, its eyes narrowing, and with a speed that belied its size, it surged toward her. Water exploded around her as she tried to push herself back onto the overturned boat, but there was no escape. The thing's enormous, clawed hand wrapped around her ankle, yanking her from the boat with terrifying ease. Her scream was cut short as she disappeared beneath the water, the dark surface swallowing her whole. The others watched in helpless horror, their bodies frozen, their minds unable to process what was happening. One of the men tried to move, to swim toward the distant trees, but his limbs felt leaden, weighed down by the terror that gripped him. He knew, deep down, that no one could outrun this. And then, as if to confirm his worst fears, the creature surfaced again. This time, it brought her body with it, limp and lifeless in its massive claws. The tourists gasped, their stomachs turning as they saw her face, eyes wide open, mouth agape in a silent scream, her skin pale and lifeless. The creature let out another low growl, a sound so deep it vibrated in their chests, and then, without ceremony, it tossed her body aside, letting it sink slowly into the black water. It wasn't feeding. It was playing. The realization sank into the survivors like a stone in their stomachs. This thing wasn't just hungry, it was toying with them, savoring their terror. It had been waiting for this, for something living to wander into its domain, and now it had all the time in the world to take them, one by one. A sharp splintering sound broke through the suffocating silence. The boat, already cracked from the earlier attacks, gave a sickening creak as the creature pressed its massive weight against it. The wood splintered further, and with one final groan, the boat split in half, sinking fully into the water. The survivors screamed, desperately trying to stay afloat as the boat disappeared beneath them. Their world had collapsed into chaos. They kicked and thrashed in the water, eyes darting in every direction, knowing that whatever lurked beneath could strike at any moment. But the creature wasn't in a rush. It moved slowly, deliberately, its massive form barely disturbing the water as it circled them. The fog swirled around it like a shroud, making its hulking shape seem even larger, more menacing. Its glowing eyes never left them, watching, waiting. One of the men, his face twisted in terror, began to swim frantically toward the trees, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His movements were wild, uncoordinated, driven purely by survival instinct. "I'm not dying here. I'm not," he never finished his sentence. A long, dark tentacle shot out of the water, wrapping around his waist and yanking him under with such force that the water exploded in a spray of mist. The others could only stare in horror as the man's body vanished, his final scream cut short as the bayou consumed him. It was over in seconds. The surface of the water rippled, eerily calm again, as if nothing had happened. "We have to do something," one of the women screamed, clutching at a nearby branch that floated past. "We can't just wait for it to kill us." Another loud splash. The creature was close again, its massive body gliding silently through the water toward them. It was toying with them, savoring their fear. There was no escape. The bayou was its hunting ground, and they were its prey. Then, from the far end of the fog, something strange happened. A light, a flickering, pale light, appeared in the mist. It was faint at first, but it grew stronger, brighter. The fog swirled around it, parting just slightly, as if whatever was approaching demanded space. "What is that?" someone whispered, barely daring to hope. The light moved toward them, cutting through the oppressive darkness. It wasn't a lantern or a fire. It was something else, something that shimmered with an otherworldly glow. The creature, sensing the change, stopped its approach. Its massive body recoiled slightly, as though it too felt the presence of something it feared. The light grew brighter, and with it came a soft sound, like a distant hum, reverberating through the mist. The bayou, so silent moments ago, seemed to come alive with this new presence. The water rippled, and the air grew lighter, as though the oppressive weight of the swamp was being lifted. The creature let out a low, rumbling growl, its glowing eyes narrowing as it backed away from the survivors. For the first time, it seemed uncertain, almost hesitant. The light drew closer, and the mist parted fully, revealing its source, a figure standing on a small patch of land, just at the edge of the water. It was a woman, her skin pale and her eyes glowing with the same eerie light as the creature's. She was dressed in tattered, ancient clothing, her hair wild and dark, cascading over her shoulders. She lifted her hand toward the creature, and the thing let out a sound that could only be described as a whimper, retreating further into the water. The smaller creatures, which had been circling nearby, vanished entirely, disappearing into the depths without a trace. The woman's voice, soft and melodic, cut through the mist. "This is not your time," she whispered, her words carrying an ancient power that seemed to resonate through the bayou itself. The creature hesitated for a moment longer, its eyes flicking between the woman and the terrified survivors, before it let out one final, ear-splitting roar and sank beneath the water, disappearing into the black depths from where it had come. The bayou fell silent once again. The woman turned her glowing eyes toward the survivors, her expression unreadable. "Leave this place," she said softly. "It does not belong to you." Without another word, she turned and vanished into the mist, the light fading with her until there was nothing left but darkness and the faint, eerie glow of the moon above. The survivors, numb and exhausted, floated in the water, too stunned to move. The ancient hunger had been sated, for now.